I have a 7.6 case here. Drain holes, and if you can see, it has the bosses under the cylinder studs. This is the improved cases. This case has a problem. Cannot turn it over. There's no oil pump. That isn't the problem. Or the spacing behind the crankshaft. So what's left? It's either one of these cams, either my intake or my exhaust cam. I have a little bit of play on my exhaust cam, in and out. You can hear it, but I can see that my intake cam is squeezed hard against the bosses. This boss, and this is the rear case boss. If I were to measure to the front boss, it's 1 inch this away from this edge. And if I measure, this is the front case. This front boss is 1 inch away from this edge. This is the rear case. The rear case boss is 2 inches away. So when the cases are together, there's 3 inches inside to play with. If you measure a bunch of cams, they come out pretty close to, I'm measuring between the shoulders here, they average 350. The gear which drives the cam, you'll notice that the front is right up flush, but the back can fit over the boss. So the inside measurement is 625. Combine those and you're looking at 2975. That leaves us about 25 thousandths normally to play with inside here. This one doesn't have 25 thousandths, and that one for certain does not. I'm going to take this guy apart and we're going to measure these cases. This engine came to me from a friend. He said it's just too tight. It won't work right. I can believe it. Got my cases apart on my problem, and I found that it was not these bosses. The front case, the boss measured from this surface, measured back 1.005, 5 thousandths deeper than standard. The rear case measured back from this surface back, measured 2.015, 15 thousandths deeper than standard. My problem was that the gear, I pulled this keyway out of this cam. The gear was not fully seated against the shoulder. I had about a 20 plus thousandths gap in there. When I pulled it apart, this woodruff key was in there, and it's pretty well chewed up. This one was probably stopping the gear from going all the way down in, up against the shoulder. I took another gear, machined, about 25 thousandths off it. So when I put this together, I'm going to use a better key back on the same cam because the lift is the best that I have. Put it back with a new woodruff key, press it down, put it back together, try again. I think that will fix the problem with the tight engine. Then it'll be the spacing here. We noticed that If we use this as a depth gauge and we set it like so, we got about 80, well, that's about 95 thousandths. Let's try again. About 85, 90 thousandths. So 85, 90 here, that bearing has to be at least that far in there. This bearing's kind of tight, but it can be moved. How far in does that bearing go? Well, that bearing goes all the way up against the gear, like so. This would be into the flywheel. This would be the part sticking out right now. So, notice the bearing goes all the way up against the shoulder of that gear. And then, if there's still a gap between the bearing and the housing, you shim it. Should be able to move this back and forth about 20 thousandths. The front of this flywheel assembly seats against the case by the shoulder. This is the drive pinion shaft on this side. So that goes into the casting until the casting butts against this shoulder. And that's supposed to be fully flush. The only gap would be behind this bearing and a little bit of play in and out of the flywheel assembly. If there's no play, no bush, no shim inside here. If there's play, too much play, shim inside here. The same way with the old Lowe's style pump. Shims right against the bearing. The size of the pump gears, that can be seen. These pump gears here are twice the size. The pump is a higher volume, but as it's pumping a higher volume, it's also developing greater pressure. This one is the fittings are in the case. This one, the fittings are in the body. That's about the big differences between the high and the low. And we'll get it back together and try again. Thank you. Well, I squeezed it back together. And guess what? It turns. So it was the intake cam, the way that gear sat on the shaft. Wasn't flush, plus I trimmed a little off. By the way, the cam timing is done by this Woodruff key slot. This gear will fit either in the intake or an exhaust. These gears, Gravely was smart, being frugal. They made the gears all the same. They made the slots, the timing component of the camshafts. Okay, now got to make sure that my oil pump housing has enough room. I can probably tap this bearing in some. I don't know if it's fully seated. We'll work on that. Got her bolted back together, and we tap the bearing in, and we tap the flywheel assembly back. Why did I tap the flywheel assembly back? That bushing on the timing on the drive pinion shaft has some play in it. You want to bias the flywheel assembly forward. You can actually see the gap there. Now we can make an accurate measurement back to the bearing. If I tip it over, and I'd be pushing the flywheel assembly and the bearing back. Don't want that. Okay, right there. I have, looks like, need my glasses, 109 thousandths. Let's try again. $107 thousandths back. Now, if we measure the oil pump shoulder, we measure 85 thousandths. 85 thousandths from 107 sounds like 22 thousandths gap between the back of the oil pump and the bearing. That's an ideal gap. Does not need a shim in there. If I put a shim in there, it would be too tight. What does too tight mean? Remember, this bushing is, the flywheel assembly rotates inside this bushing. But if we're pushing the flywheel assembly against this bushing, look what happens. There's a good 10, 15 thousandths wear there. This is a brand new bushing. No wear whatsoever. And this one has the oil galley on the inside. It's keyed to the case so that oil coming through from the filter enters down into this port, into the drive pinion, through the front flywheel, into the crank pin, lubricates, crank, the connecting rod. Next, we know that we don't need a gasket. Next thing to check after this is bolted together is take a good flat surface and check the gears. See if the gears catch as you're moving this around. This one catches. Notice, I'm catching that gear. I'm going to need not only one gasket back here, I'm going to need two, because that gear will cut into the oil pump cap. If you have it spaced just right with the right number of gaskets here, you'll develop great oil pressure. If you ran this with only one gasket right now, it's going to drag, and you may even shear that tiny little key in there, like this one has been sheared. And it could be that it caught a piece of crud, or it could be that the cover was too darn tight. Same thing drives the old style oil pump. Little keyway in there. Okay. That's it for this case right now. Thanks.